Jerusalem is a reenactment of the Israelites, marching out of Egypt and going up to the promised land. Like, what does that do to you psychologically? That starts to mess with you. And it starts to get you thinking the way that the prophets of the Bible think, which is in these patterns of history. And that when I'm supposed to see my life as yet another chapter of the reenactment of the biblical trauma. And so when God does what he does in the world, it usually involves confronting injustice and evil and freeing his people. And so it's inviting the exiles to see themselves as a part of a new chapter of the biblical story. And then it all culminates in the rebuilding of the temple and the celebration of Passover, which is what followers of Jesus do every time they gather and they take the bread and the cup, isn't it? That's exactly what's happening. We're saying, but with these symbols, that we are part of this drama, and we ourselves are a part of the new Exodus people and the new Exodus story. That's how these narratives work, and so that's why the new Exodus thing is a big deal here. Which leads on into the next main theme here. And this I think you could do this in a whole message or a whole class. But just to watch, when God's people are rebuilding their identity, they've been in exile in a foreign land, they need to come back and rediscover who they are. How do they do it? And if you read in chapter 3, they just systematically go through, and the first thing they do is they rebuild the altar. This is in Ezra chapter 3. And just watch how it works. So they come back, they gather as one man in Jerusalem, Yeshua, the high priest, Zerubbabel, they all get together. What's the first thing they do? They rebuild the altar. So and the altar is going to be this place where they bring their tokens of gratefulness to God. And then it's the place where their sins are covered. I mean, think. Like the sacrificial system hasn't been operating for a couple generations now. So we're restoring the way that we connect to God. We're retelling the story of how he's given us a means to cover for our sins so that he can dwell with us. It's the place where we bring what we have as gifts of gratefulness to God. It's the first thing they rebuild. Then they celebrate the Feast of Booths. They set up their liturgical calendar so that their lives are structured by the biblical story. And so they see them like this is like Christmas and Easter and Pentecost and all these kinds of things. It's the Christian liturgical calendar, but these are ways that God's people remind themselves of the story that they're living. After that, they celebrate tabernacles. This is cool. Where's that line? In 3:11. After the altar, then they come together and they start laying the foundations of the temple. That's the next thing they do. And then they start building the choirs, all the choirs of the Levites. And then they establish worship as a part of their rhythm. And then there's this quote from this famous line. It gets repeated all throughout Psalm 136 and so on. Praise the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. And they shout with a great shout, and they praise the Lord because the foundation was laid. So this becomes where's the wisdom here? The wisdom is the God's people, if you're a covenant people, you need some strategies for helping remind you and your people of your identity, who you are in the world, why you exist. What are we here for? Why did God do what he did for us? And so how do you help a group of people maintain that identity when there's Babylon and Persia, all these other kingdoms out there, and they have their own story and identity they want to, force on the covenant people? And so what do? They rebuild, they focus on rhythms of worship. They focus on rhythms of the gathering. They focus on rhythms of gratefulness and offerings. They focus on the calendar. They focus on worship. How you guys doing? This isn't particularly innovative. You know what I mean? Gather regularly to worship God. Well, that's an idea, So I understand that, but this is important. I think there's wisdom here that should at least force us to think creatively. Again, we can't generate revival, but we can get in the way of it. I think in one way of getting in the way of it is to not have patterns in our lives as individuals and a community that are retelling the story of Jesus and the kingdom. When we lack patterns for a group of people, I don't know. It's hard to follow Jesus, isn't it? And the moments where I actually feel the most faithful, the most full of faith, is usually involves other people who are followers of Jesus. And it's usually when we're worshiping or when we're doing something to follow Jesus together. And I'm like, oh yes, this is who I am. This is what I'm about. Are you with me? So you're in ministry. This is really important. But it becomes so rote, and facilitating those rhythms, right, can become such a rigmarole that you forget how powerful those rhythms are. Or we feel the need to reinvent them all of the time. And so I understand the different philosophies and whatever. It's a big room, different philosophies of ministry. But I think we'd all agree that these rhythms play a crucial role, don't they, in some way? And so that's precisely the first thing that the people do, is reinstitute these rhythms of worship. So for my money, first message, teaching would be here on the hyperlink and the prophetic package of hope. And the first thing would be maybe the end of chapter 1 and this section of chapter 3. And this is about how God's people rebuild their identity when they enter a new moment and an uncertain future, and they have to remind themselves of who they are. And I would do the end of chapter 3. I'm going to call that 1B. Sorry. The end of chapter 1, call it 1B, and then the stuff about the rebuilding and the rhythms of worship from chapter 3. How you guys doing? Cool. All right. So, hooray, go team. It's all going to work out rosy, right? So here's this interesting story in chapter 4. Now, when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the people of the exile were building a temple to the Lord their God. Now, you've never heard of these people? This is the first time they're introduced in the story. And who the enemies of Judah and Benjamin are is a category of characters in the book that list is going to grow. There's going to be all these different characters you're going to meet who represent these enemies. But they're just talked about as a group right here. And look at how they introduce themselves. They approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the father's household, and they said to them, "Hey, can we help you build the temple? Listen, just like you, we worship your God. We're the people we've been sacrificing to Yahweh, the God of Israel, for a long time here. We've been in this land since Esarhaddon, the king of Assyria, brought us here." Hyperlink? Some of you are like, oh yeah, I was just reading that story yesterday. So do you remember that? Significant. This is when there were two waves of exile, one for the northern kingdom, one for the southern kingdom. Who were the bad guys who took out Jerusalem? Babylon. Who were the bad guys who took out the northern kingdom? Assyria. So that hyperlink takes you to 2 Kings 17, where that story is told. And it's along, the narrator pauses the story, gives a long sermon on why the northern tribes were taken out by Assyria. They were idolatrous, they allowed social injustice, and so on. But then there's this really fascinating story at the end. It says, after the northern tribes were hauled off into exile, This is 2 Kings chapter 17. The king of Assyria brought people from all over the ancient Near East: Babylon, Cuthah, Avah, Hamath, Sepharvaim, and he settled them in the cities of Samaria, in the place of the sons of Israel. They possessed Samaria, they lived in its cities, and when all of them first arrived, they didn't know about the God of Israel. So therefore, the Lord sent lions among them and killed some of them. So bizarre. There's actually a literary ninja thing happening here with the lions that appeared in 1 Kings chapter 13. It's actually brilliant what's happening. But anyway, the whole point is bad things start happening in the land, and the people start asking, whoa, what's the God of the nation that we just got moved into around here? Maybe we should pay attention to that God. But it's bizarre nonetheless. So here's what they say. The nations whom you've carried away into exile here in Samaria, they don't know the custom of the God of the lands. So there's all these lions hurting people. And so we don't know the custom of the God of the land. And so the king of Assyria says, oh yeah, let's go get some Israelite priests, bring them back, and they can teach the people how to worship Yahweh. And what they do, however, is worship Yahweh along with all their traditional gods and so on. It's just, right? Syncretism. And so these are the people. It's the ancestors, the like great-great-great-grandchildren of these people groups that approach Ezra right here at the beginning of Ezra chapter 4. And these people are going to, as you read through the course of the story, they're going to become the enemies of Judah. Why? Well, let's keep reading. What is Zerubbabel and Yeshua's response to them? Zerubbabel and Yeshua, the rest of the heads of the father's household, said to them, you have nothing in common with us in building a house to our God. We ourselves together will build for Yahweh, the God of Israel, just like Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. And so how did the people of the land then feel in response? So the conflict begins. So you just have to pause and you just have to say, how am I supposed to take this? How are you supposed to read that? If you just read the stories of Ezra, you could just say, well, it's true, like Cyrus didn't tell all these other people groups to rebuild the temple, did he? No, he told the exiles who were coming back, and he gave them the permission and the resources to build. So Zerubbabel and Yeshua, they're just following orders, and they meet some people who are polytheists, but they think they can worship Yahweh too, but that's the way of compromise. So they say, no, you have nothing to do with us. And unfortunately, that creates conflict. That would be one way of reading it, isn't it? Be one way. You're going to read on into the next chapter, and you're going to find out which prophets were hanging out with Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah. Haggai and Zechariah. And those are just little hyperlinks there that the narrator's saying, dear reader, go reread Haggai and Zechariah, get it all in your head, and read this book in light of those books of the Hebrew Bible. And Zechariah specifically has multiple places. I'll just point out two, where he says things like this. So he's in the thick of trying to encourage the exiles to rebuild. And so he says things like this. Zechariah chapter 2, verse 10. Sing for joy, be glad, O daughter of Zion. I'm coming to dwell in your midst. It's the prophetic package of hope. Return, rebuild, new temple, nations, messianic kingdom. Many nations are going to come and join themselves to the Lord in that day and become my people. That's when I'm going to dwell in your midst. That's when you'll know that the Lord of hosts sent me to you. The Lord will possess Judah as his portion in the land. He'll choose Jerusalem. Be silent, all flesh, for the Lord is aroused from his holy habitation. So now you tell me. The author of Ezra, Nehemiah, intends for you to have a text like this in your mind. And when you read that story that you just read in Ezra chapter 4 with this text in your mind, how are you supposed to read that? Are you with me? you're supposed to think, was this a missed opportunity? Right? Was this a moment where they created unnecessary enemies? So I included in that folder where you got these notes on my website to download. I think it was a paper that I had at least sent out. Maybe some of you read it, by a Hebrew Bible professor at Multnomah down in Portland named Ray Lubeck, called Ezra&Nehemiah Reconsidered. There you go. So he was the first one to point this out to me many years ago, and then he wrote that as an academic paper to kind of summarize his take. And I think he's right. I'm compelled by it still this many years later, that if you just read Ezra and Nehemiah by itself, you walk away thinking these bad guys are just bad guys beginning to end, and it was good that Zerubbabel isolated themselves. But when you read Ezra and Nehemiah as part of the hyperlinked Hebrew Bible, you start to view their response as a little more ambiguous. Are you with me? And so the question would be, I think the question here is about when God's people go about rebuilding their identity, what's the posture that they should have towards people around them with other identities and other stories? And it's hard to know their motives, like when they say, let us build with you. It could be political opportunism, yeah? It could be a danger towards religious compromise, because they're going to want to introduce the worship of other gods in this temple once they finish helping us. Or it could be that this is a genuine opportunity for people who don't give their allegiance to the God of Israel alone, but they will convert to that and discover the joys of God's love and grace. And so this was a missed opportunity. That's the view that I take, and I think that it's a powerful kind of matching teaching to this here. It's about, as God's people rebuild their identity, what is their relationship? Help me think of a phrase. I don't want to use the word outsiders, but why not? Well, I mean, it's technically, religiously, sociologically true. They're outsiders to the covenant people. Cohabitators. Yeah, here, I'm just going to put neighbors. Neighbors. How do you relate to your neighbors? And it's hard to discern the motives of your neighbors in forming partnerships. But we at least get a case study here of what leading with an offhand approach does. It creates enemies, and it forces you to think of, was that necessary or unnecessary? And was that a missed opportunity? And I think it takes wisdom. I'm not saying that Ezra and Nehemiah is always saying, make partnerships galore, no matter what your value system is. I don't think that's what it's saying. But the story raises the question as a tension that God's people will face when they're in a new place and a new time rebuilding their identity, how they relate to neighbors, and that it requires great wisdom. Here, just one follow-up, because there were a couple good questions about it, and it's the focal point. If you're going to think about doing a message or a teaching on the thing we just talked about, the neighbors, the question is, if these people have innocent motives, why, and if I think the biblical authors are literary ninjas, why do they introduce these characters as the enemies? Doesn't that lead us to say, the narrator wants me to view this request as having ill motives, malicious motives or something like that? So I think there's so here's the two roads you could go down. One road would be to say they're introduced as the enemies because the narrator knows, he's introducing this as a set of characters. In the story of Ezra, there's going to be other enemies. In the story of Nehemiah, there's going to be other enemies. And so we're creating the category of there's a group of people who are going to be opposed to the people rebuilding. So you could take it as we're evaluating these people from the very beginning, the time we introduce them. They are the enemies, and everything they say or do is about opposition. It could be that it's a neutral introduction. If the author is living long after Ezra and Nehemiah, who's framed the whole book together. And so the author is telling the story of the return of the exiles. And so it could be that the author is saying, dear reader, there was a group of enemies that spanned this whole time period. How did they become the enemies? Here's the story. And then that story is what you're reading right here. So it's a genuine ambiguity. Later on in the story itself, in verse 4, the narrator calls them the people of the land. And this is actually here, can we get the Bible, my screen up on the screen. Look at Ezra 4, verse 4. Or just get it in front of you. They're called the people of the land. Do you see that term? So if you've read through the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, you know this term. You've come across this term before. And what's interesting is that the people of the land can refer to other non-Israelites living in the land, but there's about 12 uses of the word, about a dozen uses of this phrase to refer to Israelites. And they were landowning Israelites in the kingdom of Judah, and many of whom were not exiled. So this term can refer to the people who got imported under the king of Assyria a long time ago. This term can also refer to Israelites who never were exiled. They just remained in the land. Are you with me? So the land was not completely emptied of Israelites. Go read again the narratives of the exile of Jerusalem and Judah in 2 Kings, and it tells you that there were people who remained in the land. Not everybody came out of Babylon to go back to it. And so once you come back to it, you just have a cultural melting pot in the land of Judah. You've got the people who were imported by the kings of Assyria. You've got Israelites who never left. And you have the Israelites who returned. And all of them are going to have a difficult time getting along. So they're called the enemies in this first point, and then they're called the people of the land afterwards. So I think it's a genuine ambiguity. I think the author knows that Zechariah said what he said about the nations coming to participate in the rebuilding of the temple. And maybe, you might not want to, you could slant how you teach the story in terms of these people were just innocent. You could slant the story of these people had malicious motives, or you could just say, it's hard to tell sometimes, isn't it? And so when God's people are rebuilding their identity, there's this balance between circle the wagons, and because there is an element of which, if we're setting ourselves apart as the covenant people to become a blessing to the nations, you have to maintain your identity in some way. And they do it through rebuilding their identity through worship and these rhythms. But at the same time, it takes wisdom to know how tight to keep the boundary lines when it comes to how you partner with neighbors. And to me, I just think that's such an interesting and relevant question that every generation has to ask themselves. And this story is a perfect story to raise that set of issues and to talk about the unintended consequences that can happen. How you guys doing? Great. Okay, so we could talk about Ezra 1 through 6 a lot more, but we won't. We have to move on. We get to the next iteration of the theme. And so we are going to have Ezra be introduced to Ezra, and he's going to come rebuild the religious identity of the people by calling them to faithfulness to the Torah. So he's rebuilding the community through the Torah. Zerubbabel was rebuilding the altar and the temple and the people's identity. So, Ezra 7 through 10, what on earth? So many cool things going on here. First of all, he's introduced to us in Ezra 7, and he's a boss. He just comes onto the scene after these things in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia. Oh, by the end of chapter 6 and by the beginning of this right here, That's a little notice to tell you, dear reader, about 50 years just passed between the ending of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7. So decades. And Ezra, you have Ezra, son of Sariah. You get this long genealogy. And you're like, really? Is this really necessary? Yes, it's necessary. And it's awesome. Throntvates points this out. It's this brilliant little symmetry where you have Ezra as the first element, Aaron, the brother of Moses, as the last element. Then you have the 7 priests after the destruction of the temple, matched by the 7 priests before the destruction of the temple. And at the center is the priest whose name matches Ezra's name, Azariah, who was the priest that Solomon appointed in his temple. So you spell, we'll do this real quick. So Ezra, that's in Hebrew that's a good transliteration of it. But Azariah in Hebrew is essentially just Ezra with ayah on the end. Are you with me? So Ezra just means help. It's the Hebrew noun for help. And then Azariah here at the center means help, and then Yah, which is the short form of Yahweh, the covenant name of God. Yahweh helps, or Yahweh is help. So isn't that great? So he's introducing you to Ezra as he's like the super high priest. He's the super Aaron. And he's like the super Moses. And so he's going to come back and he's going to do all the things that Moses did. He's going to teach the Torah. He's going to lead another wave of people through the wilderness. The new Exodus stuff, the volumes turned up to 11 in this section. There's so much new Exodus stuff happening here. So he's introduced, and he's a scribe of the Torah, we're told. I mean, look at this. He's a scribe skilled in the Torah of Moses that the Lord had given. The king granted him all he requested because God's hand was on him. Do we like this guy? He's the Psalm 1 person, right? We like him. We're immediately predisposed to like him by how he's being introduced here. This is in the notes. And I don't know how this preaches, but it's kind of cool. Just to show you, all these little details in Ezra's story are connected to the same new Exodus thing here. So he times his departure from Babylon to be the first day of the first month. Hyperlink to Exodus 12, verse 1. Now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month, the day that you go up out of Egypt, this month is the beginning of the months for you. It is to be the first month of the year for you. So Israel's religious calendar got reset to the Exodus, is the new year, marking their religious new year. And lo and behold, what day did Ezra pick to start his movement out of Babylon? The first day of the first month. Are you with me? It's brilliant. It would be like, it would be the equivalent of saying, starting a new political party in America and having your launch ceremony on July 4th or something like that. That would be the equivalent here. It's very intentional symbolism here. So he times his departure from Babylon to coincide with the Exodus. Then there's that strange little story of he gets a little bit out of the city and he's like, wait, where are the Levites? We don't have any Levites. It's a really odd part of the story. And so he stops everything and he's like, we need to get some Levites. And so he sends his message and they go get these, they get 39 Levites or something, or all who would show up. And then they're like, okay, now finally we can go. And you're just like, what is going on here? Okay, well, who's absolutely crucial in carrying the temple vessels when the Israelites are wandering through the desert? It's Levites. So he's even making his entourage on the way back from Babylon mimic the people wandering through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. He also gets sponsored by the treasures of the Persians, just like the first wave did. Oh, this is cool. In chapter 8, verse 21, they pray that God, they humble themselves to pray that God would give them, this is a New American Standard, translates this phrase, a safe journey. This is Ezra 8:21. Any other translations? Everybody has safe journey? Everybody has safe journey. Any footnotes? New American Standard gives you a little footnote, at least. A straight way. A straight path. Literally in Hebrew, a straight path. We humbled ourselves to seek from God a straight path. Anybody? The ninjas are at work. Ninjas are at work here. Yeah. Where else do you read about a straight path? Isaiah 40. Comfort my people. Exile's over. It's all paid for. Clear the way. Make straight the way for the Lord in the wilderness. Make smooth in the desert a highway for our God. So what he's praying for is that the path that they'll go on the way out of Babylon is precisely the path that Isaiah announced would happen on the. Are you with me? It's brilliant. So good. The moment he arrives in Jerusalem, he has just a 3-day camp-out rest, which is precisely what Joshua and the Israelites did after they crossed the Jordan into the land. The first thing Ezra does is get commissioned to appoint these judges and rulers who were going to implement the laws of the Torah. It's exactly what Moses' father-in-law said he should do. Remember that story? Remember Jethro? It says, like, Moses, I know you're my son-in-law. This potentially awkward relationship, but here's what I think you should do, right? It's great. And then last but not least, if you read the list, it reads like another one of these census lists in Ezra&Nehemiah. But if you count up how many families he takes with him, there's 15. 2 of them have priestly lineages. 1 of them is a descendant of David, and then 12 other families. 3 and 12. 3 and 12. How you doing? 3. What's the 3? What is the 3 a symbol of? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then what's the 12? 12 tribes, 3 and 12. You guys. Look at the shape of the orange section of the prophets. In the Hebrew Bible, the middle section is called the prophets. You get Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. It's Israel's story from the point of view of the prophets. That's why it's in the prophets. And then you get the books, the poetic books of the prophets themselves. And how many are there? There's 3 and 12. Do you see it? There's 3. Ninjas, I tell you. I'm not joking. Okay, so here's the whole, are you with me? This new Exodus. So again, this is just how biblical authors think. They're always framing and designing stories after the pattern of the foundation stories in the Torah. It's like the foundation stories give you the main template for everything that is to come. And that's why the story of David and Bathsheba, I just noticed this recently, the story of David and Bathsheba, he goes out on his balcony, he sees her, he desires her, he takes. He sees, he desires, and he takes. Anybody. It's precisely the vocabulary of Genesis 3. When Samson sees a Canaanite woman, that she's good to the eyes, he desires her and he takes her. When Achan, in the book of Joshua, right after Jericho, he sees this nice Babylonian cape, and he saw that it was desirable, and he took it. So this is how the biblical authors write. They're constantly giving you little clues so that you hyperlink the stories back to the stories in the Torah, and then you ponder, you meditate, and you think about their relationship. And all of a sudden you realize, like, the story of human rebellion and sin, it's really just one story happening. And it just gets repeated in all these different ways. But that's also true of the Exodus story. The Exodus story gives you the template for what salvation is in the Bible. And then every time in the stories to come that the authors want to say, hey, dear reader, this was an event in history that was a part of the covenant salvation story, they'll retell it in a way to link it up with all these Exodus hyperlinks. And that's precisely what's happening here. So it's not just like Bible nerdness. This is a really important way that the Bible views history, and I think it encourages us to view history in the same way. And it's what I was saying earlier. When we take the bread and the cup, what are we doing? We're reenacting a Messianic Passover meal and saying, we are a part of the Exodus generation, and God raised up a deliverer for the universe when it was languishing in slavery to sin and decay. And are you with me? So these are just cool little clues, but they're a part of how the Bible's messing with your mind and teaching you how to view history and how to think about your own life story. So there you go. That's the new Exodus stuff with Ezra. That's awesome. The next thing that Ezra does is institute the Torah. He's trained in the study of the Torah. He comes back. He's commissioned to investigate how the people are being organized, and he's commissioned to do it according to the law of his God. That's what he's told to do. So he's about rebuilding identity through the Torah. So you could say this. This perhaps would be the focus of the rebuilding in Ezra. What did they rebuild? Do you remember? They rebuild the altar, and then the altar allows them to reinstitute what? So we're talking about structures and rhythms, right? That's what they do to rebuild identity. What does Ezra bring along to rebuild identity? The Bible. The Bible is his tool for reforming identity and rebuilding the people's identity. They do religious rhythms as a community. Ezra represents this renewal of commitment to the scriptures as the terms of the covenant. So, is this a class or a message where it's about the Bible? None of this sounds innovative, I know. But it's reflecting on when God's people enter new, uncertain times, when we need to be reminded of who we are. We have rhythms for how we operate as a community, and one of those key rhythms is that these texts play a central role in who we are, and that reading on them, meditating them, singing them, talking about them when you get up and when you lie down, this is really an important part of who we are, and finding creative ways to do that. And as we're going to see, I think the matching part to this is Ezra discerns there's a problem. He finds out about a problem in the community, and he creatively interprets scripture to speak to this new problem. That's the next part here. So something like that. And I don't know what you do with the new Moses stuff. It's just awesome, and you should know about that. But okay, so that's Ezra. That's who he is, and that's what he does. I want to camp out on this for. Okay, perfect. Yeah, this is great. This is about the mixed marriages and the divorce decree. So I'll kind of set the table for it. Here are the key challenges in dealing with this text and this story, and this will provide great lunch conversation. So here's when Ezra comes back and he gets into town, and everybody hears about it. This is in Ezra chapter 9. The leaders, the princes, approached me and said, "The people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land." There's that term again. "According to their abominations, those of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites." Okay, so what does that mean? What actually has been done? Well, some of the people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, have taken some of the daughters of the people of the land as wives for themselves and their sons, so that the holy race, or any other translations there? Holy race is the New American Standard. Yes, yeah, literally in Hebrew, it's holy seed. It's the word for descendants. So that the holy seed is intermingled with the people of the lands. And indeed, this isn't just, the average Israelites. It's the princes and the rulers who are the foremost in this. And what is Ezra's response? He tears his clothes apart, and he pulls out some of his hair, and he's appalled. And then everyone else who's really bothered by this news gathers together. And Ezra offers one of the 9 prayers in the Bible. There's 3 prayers that happen in chapter 9 of these books after the exile. So there's Ezra 9, Daniel 9, and Nehemiah 9. They're all prayers of corporate prayers of confession. And it's this long prayer of like, oh no, the new Exodus is repeating itself. And we're the wilderness generation, and we are repeating the guilt of our ancestors and from the days of our fathers. Are you with me? And he just goes off the whole thing, repenting. We haven't been following the Torah. And so, what is the solution? The solution comes from a guy named Shechaniah. And here's what he says to Ezra. "We've been unfaithful. We've married these non-Israelite women from people of the land. But there is yet hope for Israel. Let's all make a covenant to send away these wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord, Ezra, and all of us here who support this idea because we tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it all happen according to the Torah." And that's all what they do. They all take an oath. There's 2 guys who don't like this idea. They're introduced down here in verse 15. Jonathan, the son of Asahel, and Yahaziah, the son of Tikva, and Meshullam, and Shabbatai. They don't like this idea. They think it's a bad idea, but they don't win the day. And then you get a long list of all of the offenders, and the people say, let's just go group by group, let's get judges, let's create a committee. They create a committee, and they interview each person, and then we're given a long list. And the people actually say, listen, can we get a committee on this? Because the day that they all gather in the square is raining really hard. And so they're like, it's cold and it's rainy and this is a really complicated mess, so let's make a committee. And so they make a committee. And then here's the list. And then that's the end of the Ezra section. How you guys doing? Okay, so let's talk. Let's be open-minded, right? What are we supposed to make of this? So here's what's going on here. Hugh Williamson, who has the top shelf, no stone unturned. His commentary on this section, it's long, but it's excellent. I learned so much. Here's what he says. Here's the problem as they see it. The substance of the confession is that some members of the religious community, their spiritual leaders, had both married, not kept themselves separate from, and adopted some of the religious practices of the rest of the Palestinian population. these, who are these people of the land? These would have been, oh, no, excuse me, that's wrong. Who are these leaders who have married with non-Israelites? These would have been Jews whose families previous returned from exile in the time